NATO has crossed Russia's red line again and again and again. And most recently, this has occurred in relation to France and Germany too. So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about Emmanuel Macron's comments at the end of February, where he remarked, into the shock, supposedly, of other NATO members, that France and NATO as a whole were not ruling out putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. Of course, this amounts to a major escalation. It would amount to essentially a NATO confrontation with Russia, because Ukraine is, of course, in a conflict with Russia. So these comments were provided by Emmanuel Macron at the end of February, and they sent shockwaves across the collective West. And the response in particular was quite interesting. We first have to look at how the New York Times reported on the response. So this is most important because in many ways, Emmanuel Macron's comments were not simply some kind of misgiving or mistake or error on his part. What he did was simply take the mask off. So the New York Times reported right afterwards that seeking to unsettle Russia, Macron actually provokes allies. The French president's openness to Western troops in Ukraine signaled a quest for military resolve, but some allies felt blindsided. So there is Mr. Macron looking very confident. So just listen to what Roger Cohen has to say, and we're going to read this briefly and then go on to the other stories in reaction to this. So it says, with his jolted, unexpected statement that sending Western troops to Ukraine, quote unquote, should not be ruled out, President Emmanuel Macron of France has shattered a taboo, ignited a debate, spread dismay among allies, and forced a reckoning on Europe's future. For an embattled leader who loathes lazy thinking, longs for Europe of military strength, and loves the limelight, this was typical enough. It was Mr. Macron, after all, who in 2019 described NATO as suffering from brain death, who last year warned Europe against becoming America's strategic vassal. But bold pronouncements are one thing, and patiently putting the pieces in place to attain these objectives another. Macron has often favored provocation over preparation, even if he often has a point, as in arguing in 2017 that Europe needed to bolster its defense industry to greater strategic heft. This week was no exception. By lurching forward without building consensus among allies, Mr. Macron may have done more to illustrate Western divisions and the limits of how far NATO allies are willing to go in defense of Ukraine than achieve the quote-unquote strategic ambiguity he says is needed to keep Vladimir Putin of Russia guessing. So what's really interesting about this, about what Macron did, is that it was supposed to be, in the eyes of Macron, and Macron is a very arrogant neocon. He's a banker. He is incredibly arrogant, and he does not think strategically per se, even though he was calling for strategic ambiguity. What the New York Times is saying, what the overall neocon foreign policy establishment of the collective West, led by the United States, are saying about Macron, is that his mouth is looser than his actions, that his mouth is incredibly loose, and that he will essentially say anything to look big, to look tough. And this has caused great divisions. And so what Macron did was not build unity, even though I believe that NATO is in unison. They do agree with eventually confronting Russia directly, that there will, in their minds, be a confrontation between Russia and NATO at some point in the near future. It's just that the timing isn't correct because, as they will say here, there is a lot of division within NATO right now. Bloomberg, right? So it says here, as we go on, it will talk about how there are divisions between, for example, Germany and France, as well as other countries, the United States, Sweden. Olaf Scholz not only ruled out German forces, but any ground troops from European countries or NATO. And this is really preposterous, as we'll show later in this segment, that, in fact, there is no division among confronting Russia and going to war. It's the means with which you do it and how you present it. So the New York Times wrote this piece talking about how disastrous this was, echoing German media, echoing so-called NATO allies. This was the trend across the Western mainstream media. Here you have Reuters also talking about Macron's Ukraine troop talk shakes up NATO allies. So over and over, it was spoken about in the Western mainstream media as a divisive move, not one that's agreed with. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it that despite NATO's big rhetoric and ultimately its incredibly expensive outpouring of support to Ukraine over the last few years, and we just entered the third year of the proxy war, why is it that NATO is backing off? That's a really important question. And it's one that is also answered by Germany's own provocation toward World War III that was leaked out by RT's editor. And I'm going to get to that in a second. But French President Emmanuel Macron wanted to create strategic ambiguity by openly discussing the idea of sending Western troops to Ukraine. But he was also so ambiguous that he sparked confusion and irritation among some allies. So his comment at a late-night news conference after hosting Western leaders to rally support for Ukraine fitted with his reputation as a diplomatic disruptor who likes to break taboos and challenge conventional thinking. So and this is interesting because the New York Times had similar comments, his comments may turn out to be prescient and pave the way for greater direct Western involvement in the war against Ukraine, against Russia's invasion sometime down the line. So again, the Western mainstream media was very clear that while Emmanuel Macron is annoying, while he may have been incorrect in stating this as he did at this moment in time, both the New York Times, I didn't show it, but here in Reuters, they say, and if you read it in one publication in the Western mainstream media, you're likely to see it in others. They talk about down the line, this might be true, and I'm going to show you how exactly serious that is. So you had the United States, you had Germany, Britain, Italy, Spain, Poland, Czech Republic, all of them distanced themselves from these comments, but nonetheless, they happened. And you would think Emmanuel Macron would have some humility, right? He messed up pretty bad. That there would be some maybe retraction, maybe some editing of the comments, maybe some clarification to his NATO allies. But actually, Macron doubled down on the Ukraine remarks after the blowback. He reiterated the seriousness of his remarks when he said he would not rule out sending Western troops into Ukraine. Macron said he carefully chose his words and doubled down on his statement despite the criticism he received in his country and internationally. These are serious issues. Every one of the words I say on this issue is weighed, thought through, and measured. So earlier this week, while hosting 27 European Union nation representatives, Macron said sending troops to help counter Russia's intensified offensive should not be ruled out. So he doubled down. Unsurprising, because his back was put up against the wall. He already is massively unpopular. And as you can see, he's somewhat unpopular amongst the United States and Germany. Bloomberg had this panic article about Macron and Olaf Scholz's so-called divisions. So there's trouble in in paradise, in the barbarous paradise that is NATO stan. Okay, to echo Pepe Escobar's wording. There is trouble in the waters, and there's a lot of divisions. And why is that? Well, for one, what Emmanuel Macron said is something that already is true in Le Monde. Right after these comments were made and reacted to by the Western mainstream media, put out this article. They said Ukraine's Western allies already have a military presence in the country. When French President Emmanuel Macron spoke of potentially sending military reinforcements to Ukraine, he unintentionally lifted the veil on the pre-existing presence of Western personnel on Ukrainian soil. So I'm not going to read the whole article. I just want to go down where they talk about this. Okay. So it says, this controversy ignited by Macron at the start of the week has opened up a debate that some consider to be an open secret. All the allied states have a presence in Ukraine. It's not a question of combat units, but there are representatives of each intelligence service, for example, said a Ukrainian diplomatic source who requested anonymity to speak candidly. They said they were pleased that the question of strengthening the allied military presence in their country has been in the air since December. If there are arms deliveries, there must be people there physically giving information on how to use the equipment. Ukraine is also being used as a testing ground for new equipment. Drones are tested there. These kinds of professionals are on the ground, of course. And who are the professionals on the ground? Well, they talk a little bit about it. There's a 12 CIA bases. That was reported by the New York Times, and I'll pull that up in a second. But beyond the small number of personnel we do have in the country supporting the armed forces of Ukraine, we haven't gotten any large-scale plans for deployment. So that was Rishi Sunak's spokesperson. However, the mainstream British media at the end of 2022 reported Robert McGowan's, a former commander general of the Royal Marines, admitting that 350 soldiers had been present, British soldiers, between January and April 2022 for special operations involving a high degree of political and military risk. His words have never been denied by London, are in line with the longstanding presence of British troops, British instructors within Ukrainian military staff due to cooperation initiated as early as 2014 and after Crimea was annexed or was federated by Russia. So, in a sense, Britain is already there. NATO is already in Ukraine, and it would be ridiculous to think otherwise, given that there has been tens of billions, hundreds of billions, over $100 billion plus worth of US, German, NATO aid that has to be accounted for and cannot just be given to an army that was literally built by NATO over a 10-year plus period. And so here is the report on the CIA by the New York Times. So the New York Times reported this just before Macron made his comment, the spy war, how the CIA secretly helps Ukraine fight Putin. For more than a decade, the United States has nurtured a secret intelligence partnership with Ukraine that is now critical for both countries countering Russia. And in this image, what the caption says, a Ukrainian soldier in a forest near Russian lines this month. A CIA-supported network of spy bases has been constructed in the past 8 years that includes 12 secret locations along the Russian border. So the New York Times was reporting this. So all in all, we have to ask ourselves, why? Why has the CIA found it so important to build a huge presence inside of Ukraine along the Russian border? Why is it so important for France to make these comments, for Macron to make these comments? Well, the answer is easy. It's important because the United States, NATO, France, Germany as a part of it, they are losing right now. They are not winning this conflict. And we are seeing a kind of unraveling that as Ukraine lost Avdiivka, as Ukraine is getting pushed further and further along that front line, as Russia's war of attrition is more and more successful, and as the aid dries up from the United States, from NATO, to any degree that will be significant from here on out in the conflict, we are seeing cracks within the NATO so-called unity. So that is why this is happening. That is why these leaks are coming out now. And it wasn't just France, because Bloomberg reported that there's huge problems, that the United States, that the West are so worried about Germany and France's conflict, that there's a conflict between these two countries within NATO, and that it needs to be rectified if there's going to be any pathway forward for Ukraine. In many ways, what Bloomberg and the collective West, the United States, are saying is that they need Germany and France to take more responsibility for Ukraine in divisions means that that's not going to happen. But nonetheless, Germany is also under fire. So it's not just France. Macron, he got the finger wagged at him. Don't say that. Washington, right? Washington is ultimately the master. Do not say that. And all of the NATO stand countries came together and said, we're going to distance ourselves from that because at this point, game over for Ukraine. So there's no reason to provoke Russia even further, even as Germany now, and this is a story that they do not want to cover. The Western mainstream media does not want to cover this story. And that is the news that RT reported on and released that Germany's top military leaders within the Air Force were discussing openly, and I'm going to play this report now, discussing openly an operation to attack, to help Ukraine bomb the Crimean Bridge, which has been bombed, of course, or attacked by numerous means through terrorist acts over the last several years. So here we go. Oh. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I played the wrong thing. um, Wrong video. So here we go. This is actually the report. That was a different. Where is it? Okay. They're called the same thing. So here we go. This should be it.
Crimean Bridge. That news. The German army has considered a strike on the Crimean Bridge. That's according to a leaked 40 minutes conversation between high-ranking German military leaders. Let's take a listen.
I came to the conclusion that there are two interesting targets, the bridge in the east and the ammunition depots above. The bridge in the east is hard to reach. It's a rather small target, but the Taurus can do it. The ammunition depots can also be hit. If we consider the bridge, I don't think Taurus is enough, and we need to have an idea of how it might work. And for that, we need satellite data. I don't know if we can train the Ukrainians for such a task in a short time. And we are talking about a month. What would a Taurus attack on the bridge look like? From an operational perspective, I can't estimate how quickly the Ukrainians will be able to learn how to plan such an action and how quickly integration will occur. But since we are talking about the bridge and military bases, I understand they want to get them as soon as possible.
The full transcript of the audio conversation also contains a discussion on how to avoid being a part of the conflict and how to do everything possible to keep Chancellor Scholz out of it. The officers also referred to the long-time involvement of the US and UK in the Ukrainian conflict. We'll bring you all the details on the...
So, I mean, there you have it. That is, it's damning. And I'll play you a little clip from this, actually, because I do have a small clip from the actual leaked audio, which has a transcript, not too long, just a few seconds. It was translated. So let me pull that up because this is damning. Of course, the United States, wherever Germany is militarily through NATO, the United States is right there. So here is the leaked audio, and I'll read if it's, let me see how they do it. If it's just English translation, I will read the English. Here we go. I can quickly add because we took a close look at it, and the bridge is unfortunately like an airfield due to its size. In other words, it may well be that I need 10 or 20 missiles for it. They're probably fully appreciated if it's where it opens up when he takes the pillars. Yes, and now the pillar, we might just make a hole in it, and then we're there. So there you have a major command. You have the commander of the Air Force in Germany, as well as his staff, talking openly about bombing Crimea Bridge. This is a huge provocation. This is a signal toward World War III. It is that serious. And so both France and Germany play with fire all the time. And this is because at the end of the day, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, as RT said, Olaf Scholz, they want to keep him out of it. Why? Because the German government is so illegitimate at this point. It has so destroyed its legitimacy, especially through the Nord Stream debacle, which is one of the biggest cover-ups in German history and the history of Europe, one of the biggest blunders. But overall, France and Germany represent through these actions just how dangerous Europe has become to itself and to the rest of the world. Because these countries, Germany and France, Macron, Olaf Scholz, and all of the actors, the state actors that are going along with the US's plan to confront and wage war against Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, they are demonstrating full-scale suicidal strategy meant to not just aid the United States in its objectives, but also in placing. It's also to place France and Germany in a subservient position to the United States. And wasn't it Macron himself who said, this was right around his visit to China last year, that, well, we don't want to be a vassal to the United States. Well, everything that France did with the NATO troops talk, everything that Germany is doing now shows that the two of the biggest players in NATO, France and Germany, are more concerned with Washington's aims, with the neocon foreign policy establishment aims, than whatever individual differences may exist amongst these countries. Washington, this is what's interesting. Washington is saying it's washing its hands of these comments, of these reports. They're repressing the German story. They don't even want to touch that. They don't want to touch the Crimea issue, because that, of course, is another red line for Russia. But when it comes to France, the United States is the one posing as being opposed in some way to what Macron was saying, that we don't want troops. We're not into a larger conflict with Russia. That's not what we want, which is preposterous, absolutely preposterous, because the United States, through the CIA, through NATO, has logistics, has personnel, has people on the ground, mercenaries, right? Quote unquote. They're all there already. So, all in all, what this shows is that France and Germany are willing to cross the red line for Washington. And why do I keep on saying for Washington? Well, listen to Mr. Lloyd Austin, because Washington officials, official Washington, continuously remarks on how NATO will eventually be fighting in Ukraine against Russia if they don't get the aid. So this is the paradox. If Ukraine doesn't continue getting aid, it'll be Russia that confronts NATO. That's the narrative right now, one that is absolutely fact-free, given everything that Putin has said, everything Russia has done. There's no evidence that Russia is going to be going into open conflict and aggressive posture toward the NATO states, the Baltic states, even Ukraine, right? It's at war with Ukraine, but at the end of the day, Russia would be quickly not at war with Ukraine if Washington was willing to do what was right and pull out of this conflict. But here is Mr. Lloyd Austin to the House Armed Services Committee, what he had to say. If Ukraine loses, I really believe that NATO troops will be fighting Russia. Here we go.
The supplemental. If Ukraine falls, again, Putin won't stop there. He will just continue to move forward and attack and take on the sovereign territory of his neighbors. And so, if you're a Baltic state, you're really worried about whether or not you're next. And so they know Putin. They know that what he's capable of. And quite frankly, if if Ukraine falls, I really believe that NATO will be in a fight with Russia in a
General's time.
matter.
NATO will be in a fight with Russia. Washington, as an empire, likes to set up the stage. It wages intense propaganda war. Putin is going after the Baltic states. All the NATO member states that are neighbors, aka the countries that are encroaching on Russia's border, they are the ones that need to be worried. This is the propaganda spin to ensure that the message at the end, NATO will be fighting with Russia, is justifiable. You see how that works there? So Lloyd Austin blew it open. And then you had the U.S. Army Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate. Yes, that's a real U.S. institution, believe it or not. But I just want to belabor this point that there is a concerted effort to wage war on Russia, to cross these red lines, to eventually begin an open conflict. And it's not just because France and Germany are the ones being the attack dogs. They're the ones out in front right now. But this is Washington's agenda. These are vassal countries. And look at what the U.S. Army Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, yes, try to say that 10 times fast, had to report. Do you know your enemy? Right? This report was published at the end of February. It says new ATP 7-100.1 Russian Tactics addresses the nation state's military doctrine with a focus on Army ground forces and tactical ops and offense, defense, and related mission sets. Scan the QR link below. So for those who don't know, the U.S. Army Combined Arms Doctrine is an organization that is dedicated to helping train U.S. military personnel on these issues. And these are the reports that it has come up with, of course, with support from the Pentagon. They essentially are writing the materials that guide the U.S. military and what they do. So I wanted to show you that because look at what they said. Do you know your enemy? Russia's the enemy. And if Russia's the enemy, then eventually you're going to be at war with Russia. And that is the point here, that all of these red lines being crossed from Germany to France, Macron, Schultz, the German Air Force, the Crimea provocations, NATO troops on the ground, CIA along Russia's border. Do you see how all of this adds up to preparing for an open war with Russia, World War III? So this is serious. This is happening. And this is something we have to be aware of. We have to understand who the players are and why they're doing it. Why Germany is doing this. It's not doing it for Germany. Why France is doing this. It's not doing it for France. These elites are in an open state of panic. The empire is crumbling. Ukraine is being destroyed piece by piece along that front line by Russia. The strategic initiative, the trajectory of this conflict is in Russia's favor. This is over. And that's why these divisions, that's why these conflicts, that's why this rhetoric is becoming more and more intense. Because at this moment, NATO has nowhere to go. They don't know what to do. And in the end, only doom can be the fortune of the United States, its NATO vassals, and of course, Ukraine. And that's a tough pill to swallow, and one that we will see continuously be struggled against. Like someone who is trying to recover, withdrawing from alcohol or some other substance, we're going to see the thrashing. We're going to see major symptoms of recovery, which are absolutely dangerous, because these, unlike people who are trying to recover from a substance, the US, NATO, they have, when they thrash about, when they withdraw from the realities of war, they end up waging more war. And that's what they are preparing for with Russia. And that is what we have to prevent at all costs. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.